There we go. Great. Okay. Well, it's 2:59 here, and Dana and I are just talking. This is our pre-show here a little bit, a moment before. It's been a great conversation. I always say some of the best stuff is right before. I should maybe extend this to 10 minutes before the time. I've been thinking about doing that, so and start right then because some of the best stuff comes in there. So it's almost 3 o'clock here in the East, in the Eastern Standard Time here, and we're just about ready to get started. And no, we didn't. Dana and I did not coordinate our colors there, but it's pretty darn close, though, isn't it? It's amazing. Yeah. So it's fantastic. So just worked out that way. But here we are. Welcome to our Red Feather Mind Body Spirit Facebook Live event. I'm Christopher McClure, and today we have a very special guest, writer and educator Dana O'Driscoll, who is the author most recently of Sacred Actions: Living the Wheel of the Year Through Earth-Centered Sustainable Practices. We wanted to catch up today to learn more about this amazing book and what's ahead. But first, a little bit about Dana. Dana O'Driscoll has been a practicing animist druid for more than 15 years and currently serves as the Grand Archdruid of the Ancient Order of Druids in America. That sounds incredibly important. It's really cool. She's also the Druid grade member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and is the OBOD 2018 Mount Hamus, am I saying that right, scholar? She writes at the Druids Garden blog and is the creator of Tarot of Trees. Dana is a certified permaculture designer and teacher. She has taught sustainable living courses and wild root foraging in her local community and in university settings. Dana lives at a 5-acre homestead in rural Western Pennsylvania. Sounds gorgeous. With her partner and a host of feathered and furred friends. We were talking about our feathered and furred friends because my dog was barking a little bit. She said there might be geese in the background, so we apologize in advance if there are any animal noises. It's all part of the whole event here. So wonderful to have you, Dana. So I love the book. It's beautiful. The books came in recently, so we have our copies. Yes, we have our copies. I know you want to hug it, and that's really the first thing. It's just this is a book I think that really just begs to be open and used and kind of lived with. It almost has a personality of its own, which is really it's endearing just immediately. I can't quite explain it, but that's all part of it. It's all part of the sacredness of it. So so before I wax too much here, so how's your day going? How are things for you today?
Things are great. Like I was telling you earlier, I spent most of the day in the garden and doing a little bit of writing, and it's a really nice day here. It's it's really this time of year here in Western Pennsylvania is just gorgeous, and it's so nice to be outside and just be part of nature.
Wonderful. Yeah. So being part of nature is just it is who you are. So I'd love to learn a bit more about your background, how you came to this point in your life.
Absolutely. So as you had mentioned, I've got a couple of different parts of me, I guess. And I think the most important part, sort of the core part of me, is being a druid. And yeah, like you said, I've been a druid for 15 years, involved in various druid orders, and nature spirituality is really important to me. And that's sort of the root of this book. But tied to that, and sort of when I became a druid, I grew really, really interested in these topics. I actually joined AODA, the Ancient Order of Druids of America, first. And AODA asked for something really simple as part of the curriculum. They said, okay, well, we want you to make 3 lifestyle changes. Find a way to, lessen your impact on the earth. And I really like that idea. And I sort of took it to a very extreme way in some cases. So, now, I live on a 5-acre homestead. I do a lot of wild food foraging, practice herbalism, practice natural building, and just, really try to think about the different ways in which I can integrate, treading lightly on the earth and doing good in the world with nature spirituality, which is where this book came from. And I'm also, of course, an educator in my professional life and a learning researcher.
Wonderful. Yeah, you mentioned about the just the simple things, and throughout this book, there are a lot of simple things that you can do. They're outlined, and as we know, it goes by the wheel of the year. But the way it's broken down is it's so straightforward. You talk about starting with the 3 ethics. The people care, the earth care, and fair share. Kind of like the basis of everything. And you go into these other pockets of the 3s. Which is very easy to kind of just bring into yourself and understand and appreciate. Is there a reasoning behind all that? How's that fold into?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the idea of 3 is really important to the Druid tradition, and we have these surviving ancient Celtic triads, and they were essentially teaching tools. So they are things that, you know, and they're always put in three. And because I was also drawing extensively on permaculture design, which has three ethics, and then I sort of got the idea, like, it'd be really neat to have a triad for each of these chapters, as a way for people to reflect, maybe meditate. And actually, as I was writing the book, I wrote the triads out, and I sort of had them on different places in my house where I could remember them.
Oh,
Thinking
oh, really?
so they can definitely be used not only as sort of a tool for sacred action, the whole point of the book, but as a tool for meditation, or just, you know, something nice to put on your wall. But that's where the idea of the triad comes from. It's actually right out of the Druid tradition, and Celtic spirituality, and I think it adds a lot to the book when we're thinking about both the Wheel of the Year and this really ancient teaching tool that we can use and apply today in various ways.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, that's really foundational, I think. But then in other aspects, you go into the three challenges that we face here, and the three principles. That's the other, you know. So like it really kind of folds all together as well. So with all of that, so how did Sacred Actions really just come into being? How did it all kind of come together in this work?
Well, I sort of think it came about in two different ways. So I think on a personal level, like, you know, there's so much. It's challenging to practice nature spirituality today. It's challenging to practice paganism today, both because of the broader cultural challenges we have with tolerance and other things, but also just because we have, you know, we've got this crisis, we've got this global crisis, and a lot of the language of that is really disempowering, right? It's this idea of, oh, you know, you can only do less bad, and if you sort of like, there's a permaculture designer named Ben Falk, and he says, if you take this to its natural end, then it's almost like you shouldn't be here. Like, you're better, like Earth is better off without you, and that's a really problematic idea as a Druid. And so when I started this journey 15 years ago, you know, one of the questions I was asking is like, how can I live in this holistic way? How can I practice this nature spirituality while living in a time where nature is under such duress? And that's where I to this idea of sacred action as sort of a founding principle for my own life and my own practice. And then the more that I shared it with my blog readers over time, because I had started blogging about this a long time ago, then, you know, other people picked up on it, like, oh, this is an exciting thing. And then the other thing is that beyond the personal, you know, when I moved into leadership in the Ancient Order of Druids in America, which was about 2013, 2014, and started mentoring others and just meeting other people who wanted to take up this path, you know, I heard a lot of the same story. It's like, how do I live in a world where, you know, what happens when the tree gets cut down the street, and I'm a Druid and I care about such things, or I'm a green witch. And so, you know, it really became, as I said in the book, it's about personal empowerment. A lot of us feel like when you read these big headlines and things like that, you really feel like, I can't do anything. Like, I feel really powerless. And this book was a way of sort of empowering people and saying, there's a lot we can do. And when we do it, it's fun. And it becomes an embedded part of who we are as a spiritual person. And it really sort of feeds into itself. So I think that's how it came into being. Obviously, there's a lot in between, you know, those, you know, all of the courses and teachers I had and the mentors I had to help me on this journey.
Okay, all right. Well, that's actually another question that I wondered. So within this interesting, fascinating journey that you've had, and impactful journey that you've had too, is there one person really that stood out who has maybe inspired you most throughout this journey?
I would say probably John Michael Greer, who has been he's a friend and mentor of mine, and he's obviously also an author and a Druid. And when I was starting to talk about these ideas a long time ago, and I was actually working on these ideas as part of my advanced work in AODA as part of the DEP project, he's the one who actually encouraged me to he's like, Dana, why don't you write a book on this? Like, we really need a book on this. And he's of course the one who wrote the foreword, so you can see that. But he really encouraged me to pursue writing this book and to getting ideas out there. And, you know, because he's also an author, he understood, you know, when I got stuck, you know, with organization and, you know, just things that you get stuck when you're writing, you know, a book like this. He was really there to support me. But more than that, just encourage me. And I think that we have a lot of ideas in the world that we need to get out and get a wider audience, and that made a lot of sense. So he was definitely, like, I would say, the writing Druid mentor. I did have other mentors as well. Of course.
I know it's a tough question. It's hard to narrow it down because there's always so many people that you know, impact your life in profound ways. And I'm impacted even too, you know, like sometimes on a weekly basis by, you know, our office people like you know, because I'm learning new things here too. There's a lot in here that of course, it's jam packed with so much good information. We were talking earlier that I'm trying to take it in bite sized chunks, so I do it a good service, really, book myself. And I think as I'm looking at this too, and hearing what you're saying earlier about cultural limitations, and I think one thing with this book is that I think it has the potential. I know it has potential to reach cross culturally. I think so. My question really with that would be: is it? Do you have to be a neo pagan or to really get something out of this book?
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay.
It's interesting. So, when I was starting to learn all of these, I was also helping with a couple of friends start a meetup group called the Oakland County Permaculture Meetup, which actually I talk about in chapter 7. A little bit about, if you wanted to do community organizing and start to bring people together and start to build community, which is an important part of this. And so I think the what was really interesting about that is we also happened to have a stone circle like in the backyard, right? And so people would come to the meetup and they were interested in organic gardening and they were sort of maybe practicing some of the practices here, but they didn't. And when you do that, when you start thinking about the soil as a living being and you learn about the every teaspoon of soil having millions of organisms and these sorts of things, like you almost take on a sacredness. And so what I like about this book is that it's sort of trying to hybridize those communities in some way. So you can so yes, of course, neo-pagans are going to get a lot out of this, especially a person like me 15 years ago who was a typical average American and suddenly has a nature spirituality practice. But I think just as much as folks that are already practicing permaculture or herbalism or natural building or organic gardening and those other things, and they might actually get a lot out of it too, because now suddenly there's a spirituality that can be embedded in it. That could reach across different communities, that could reach across different cultures, and really, interact with that. And so I do think there's this sense of like, if you think nature is sacred and you hold nature as sacred, whether or not you call yourself a neo-pagan or whether you call yourself an organic gardener or a permaculture designer, you can get something out of this, because this idea of sacred action, I think, is really, it really sort of transcends those barriers.
Yeah, and I saw that as well very clearly within this. Kind of it brings those who have that caring for the earth in general, together too, and gives a different dimension as well. So for those who maybe haven't thought about that spiritual dimension, to kind of like weave it into it there. So it's really beautifully done, and it's really a gift. I think, kind of a gift to the world. So I'm enjoying it. What did you enjoy most about kind of bringing it together and creating it? What have you really gotten out of this process?
I think that for me, because I'm a lifelong learner, I really actually enjoyed learning. Like every single thing in the book that I've written about is something I've tried and I've done. Sometimes very successfully for a long period of time, and sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe this doesn't fit my lifestyle and it's something I can't sustain.
Sure.
But I really enjoyed the process of learning. I enjoyed the process of maybe not always succeeding, but learning something and trying anew. And then really thinking about like how, I don't know, how to translate that. In writing theory, there's this idea that you learn through the act of writing, this idea of writing to learn. So I really feel like it was a learning journey for me. And it was really neat because sometimes I teach sustainability studies more formally at a university setting, and doing the worm composter at my house in several different formats, and then taking it to my students who are learning how to make a worm composter in their dorms, and then taking it to the permaculture meetup and letting people learn the worm composting, and then thinking about what is sacred about that, and it's just such a fun thing. That's what I love about it. Like sacred action is this really fun, enjoyable process that really makes you feel good and gives you, I don't know, just something additional to that, whether that's that spiritual practice or whether you're looking for that, right?
No, definitely. So I'm focused on worm composting now. I was going to, I don't know if I want to get into the intricacies of worm composting.
Yeah, and what's called vermicompost is like the fish.
Oh, is that what that was? Okay, yes.
Vermicompost, yes, worm composting. So
okay,
you take earthworms and you give them most of your food scraps, and they convert it to soil, which then you can use in your garden or even in your houseplants. And it's a really nice way of, it's something that even an apartment dweller or a student living in a dorm can do, which is another thing I tried to do in this book is, I right now live on a 5-acre homestead and I have a beautiful garden and and chickens and geese and all these things. But, for a lot of the book, I didn't. I lived in dorms. I lived in
Yeah.
apartments. I lived in urban or suburban settings. And so I really tried to craft the book in a way that it's accessible to you regardless of where you are. And really thinking about this concept of growing where you're planted. So rather than trying to say, oh, I need to have 50 acres out in the country, that doesn't really fit my lifestyle, but can I still do a lot? And the answer is
Oh, yes, yes. Uh-huh. That reality. Oh, there's something in here that really struck
the
me.
free range fantasy. Yeah.
Yes, that's one of them. No, there's one of them. Oh, actually, it's really the doing like where you're at, like doing the best good where you're at.
Yeah,
That
growing
concept?
where you're planted. Yeah.
Right, growing where you're planted. Yeah. So and you give um the analogy of the oaks, the acorn. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So that it doesn't know where it's going to be planted or get fall, whether it's from the tree or the squirrel. It just lands, and it does its best to become the mighty oak, as you're saying. And I think that's a really great that goes across anything, really, just life in general.
Yeah.
Grow where you're planted. As well. So that's it, just if nothing else, I mean, just that concept itself,
Yeah.
is worth the read. That's really cool. I was when you're talking about I'm still on the vermiculture. No, it's that impactful. No, there's a kind of a personal connection with that. My grandmother, she had a real reverence for worms. She was raised on a farm. I'm from South Central Pennsylvania, so we're in PA, a lot of farming and things. And she always wanted to have a worm farm. That was maybe her fantasy, basically. But she always really had that respect for that. So maybe she was practicing some sacred actions herself.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Just imbued in there, maybe.
Yeah.
So
It's sort of like me when I was a kid. I used to like walk down the sidewalks and like save every worm I could whenever it was raining. And
right. That's
really,
exactly what she right.
Yeah. And now of course you can, like work with those worms. And it's just like so fascinating because it's stuff that people wouldn't think of, And that's what another thing I really tried to do in the book. We all talk about like recyclable bags, take your, you have your, there, I think that there's sort of things that are now like embedded in culture that people are saying, oh, this is more green. Like I take my grocery bags to the store, I recycle and all of those things.
Right.
So what I tried to do is I also tried to sort of bring in things that were actually a lot less common. But that could really make a big impact. Like the eco brick, I did a video for you on the eco bricks, which are in the book, which is just the coolest concept because you can literally take waste and turn it into resources and then contribute to various community projects all over the world. And just so definitely some interesting and I think different things than you'll hear sort of broadly about, how do I live more green or sustainability?
Definitely, there are a lot of practical things that you can do in here to contribute and give back and just kind of bring get your own wheel going in a sense, really. So if there's I guess within that, not a loaded question is that if there's what's the most important thing you think that people could take away from it? If you get one thing out of this book, what's the most important thing that people should take away from your book?
I would say the idea of empowerment. I think that when you read the news, this is kind of what I've been getting at before. When you read the news and you're paying attention to what's happening with the planet, it gets really depressing really fast. How many species are potentially going extinct, and how it's just if you care about the Earth, it's a really, like I said, it's a really hard time to live. And the idea that you actually can do a great deal of good, and you can do this in a way that's enjoyable, that's tied to your spiritual life. I really think that empowering piece is so critical. And I mean, the book is called Sacred Action, right? And that's the idea. It's not just having us sit there and think about our inner lives, but it's the relationship between our inner and our outer lives, and in that synthesis that I think is really that source of empowerment. And to me, that really is the key of the book. And no person is going to have that same, like nobody's sacred action is going to look the same because my life is different than your life. It's different than anybody who's reading this book. But I think that if you come out of it empowered, feeling like you can do something and feeling like that can be a key part of who you are as a spiritual person and as a person in the world, that's a really powerful thing. And that really gets us away from this narrative that that all that humans can do right now is bad, and really really puts us in a place of doing good and of making a difference and of living in a way that will honor the descendants that we, that are coming into the world right now. And so that to me is like, if you can take that away, that is a really powerful place. And even if you end up going in different directions with it than I've written about, I still think that's a really powerful place for people to be.
No, it really is. That's very profound. And something else profound that I found in here, and I never know how these conversations are going to go, so I have a bunch of dog ears throughout the book and so forth. But one that I'm really trying to understand better is the concept of the zone. I'm going to try and put up here.
Yeah.
The zone.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to get it, but I'm not quite there. Could you walk me through a little bit what that's like? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the principle of the zone comes right out of permaculture design, and permaculture is permanent culture. It was a system of design and interaction with nature, humans interacting with nature, that was developed in the 70s. And since then, it's become kind of a global phenomenon. And I use permaculture. It's not a book on permaculture, but I use a lot of permaculture in the book because it's really aligned with this idea of sacred action. And so the principle of the zone, it's all about thinking about how you can make your daily patterns of life, how you can capitalize on that, essentially. So whenever we think about zone one is like your kitchen, your bedroom, your bathroom, and maybe like the patio right outside. It's the place that you're interacting with multiple times a day. The further you get from that space, so maybe you have, maybe you live in a suburban area and you've got this sort of like wild hedge that you almost never visit, that's at the very edge of your property. Maybe that's your zone 5, or even the woods across the street are your zone 5. So the idea is that if you build, if you're going to be engaging in sacred action, thinking about doing it in ways that already tie to what you do, can really help you as you're creating it. So you don't want to put your worm composter the whole way back in zone 4 or zone 5 because you might never visit it. But if it's in your kitchen, you're literally putting food scraps into it every day. So it's really and part of this is that, one of the challenges of modern life is that we're all really busy. We're all, we all don't have enough time to even, a lot of people, like when I talk to people in AODA, big challenge is like, when am I going to find time to meditate? When am I going to find time to have a spiritual practice? The same thing can be true of these sacred actions. When do I have time to do this? And so this principle of the zone can actually help us think about how we can capitalize upon the routines that we already have in our lives and build action into them in various ways. If that does that clear it up?
Yeah, it does actually. Thank you. Yeah, it brings it more into focus. It reminded me of a story you had in here about I'm not sure if a friend of yours, their children came over to visit, and you didn't realize how much that you were really living this until they're saying, "Why don't you have this? Or why don't you have that?" Like so. So it's neat. So it's and I guess my point was saying that is that it's a way to really just live the ritual, live all of it in a sense, and kind of embody that, and that's really amazing, So thank you for that. I wanted, and maybe we'll put up a little graphic of the zone there afterwards in our Facebook post there about that, because it's a really fantastic concept. That's one of the gazillion, well, not make it quite a zillion, maybe less than a gazillion, but a lot of really fantastic bits of information throughout this, and it's something that really needs to be studied and kind of lived, exactly as you're saying. So so I'm kind of interested, so for you, like what's your creative process like? How do you decide what you want to tackle next or get into next, or what's that like?
So, it's a good question. So in the Druid community, and then the part of the reason I was really attracted to modern Druidry as opposed to some of the other paths that were also nature centered is that Druidry has this thing called Awin, which is essentially creative or divine inspiration. And so as a Druid, we literally cultivate creativity in our lives as part of our spiritual practice. And so for me, that's a really important part of who I am. For me, my creative practice would be, I really like to learn new things. I like to talk to people. I do extensive writing and journaling. A lot of the ideas in this book, not everything, but pieces of it came out of the blog that I have. I do a weekly blog called The Druid's Garden. And in there, I sort of put ideas and then see how they go, see how people respond, see how I think about them. And so I think that's that, getting into that whole writing, writing as a way of learning or as a tool of inspiration. I have to do a lot of meditation, thinking about these things why is the worm composting, for example, why is that so sacred? What makes it so sacred? And I have a blog post about about what happened whenever I found all the bits of plastic in the worm compost like 6 months later, and the meditations and the thinking about that I did. So then what am I going to do with this plastic, right?
Right.
And so I think that for me, it's really about trying to cultivate a creative life and trying to live an inspired life where I'm trying to bring that into everything that I do, and trying to keep good notes on things that I do and keep good records of what I do. So when I actually sit down to write a book like this,
Mm-hmm.
I have some idea. But you know, I'm also obviously, so there's a lot of my artwork in this book. I'm an artist,
Mm-hmm.
so I have sort of a creative space. And you know, it's right over there. It's across from where I'm sitting. And you know, so I have an art studio that also has like my altar, like my druid altar, and lots of pieces of nature. And that's, you know, so I'm also trying to create an inspire lots of plants, you know, trying to create an inspiring space. So, and I would recommend that to anybody. You know, think about the creative practices that you want to do, and think about how do we cultivate that as a healthy and important part of who we are and as a part of our spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So within that constant learning, the creative process, and what do you call it? Process, the Awe?
The Awen, yeah, Awen, the Awen.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
druids even chant it. You know, we
Oh,
chant it in our rituals. We talk
okay.
about it. Our symbol for druidry is a 3 rays. It's the Awen.
Yes. Yes. Oh, right. That's right. Yeah, I'm going to focus on that in the background. So I asked you a little bit earlier before our show about the the wheel of the year, and you started here with Yule or winter solstice too, and the reasoning behind that, and just kind of like walk through a little bit of what the wheel of the year is like, perhaps.
Sure. So the wheel of the year is the wheel of the year generally is a really widely used construct within neo-paganism. It's used by Wicca. It's used by Druidry. The modern wheel of the year was created by Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols in the 1960s from a lot of older traditions,
Mm-hmm.
and that includes the solstices, the equinoxes, and then so we've got solstices and the equinoxes, and then the cross quarter days that happen about every 8 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and then so we've got this 8 spokes on this wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided to use the Wheel of the Year to organize this book because I found that with my own sacred action, there was sort of a cyclical kind of thing. There were things that I paid
Sure.
attention to in the winter. There were things that I paid attention to in the summer. And I started almost building a lot of these practices into the holidays that I was celebrating. So what am I going to do at Lunasa? What am I going to do at the winter solstice? And I started the book at the winter solstice primarily because I want to respond to these larger cultural narratives that's saying,
Mm-hmm.
that we that the things are as they are, or that we are disempowered. Some of the stuff I was talking about earlier that I personally was responding to when I started learning these things and creating these things for this book. And so in some ways it is like, I mean, it is a cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's the idea of we're coming out of this place of like, we're not sure, or our culture hasn't taught us and hasn't provided us with the tools in order to live a sustainable and regenerative life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so coming, sort of that idea of coming back into the light. And even when we think we're at this dark place, it's like, oh, there's so much I wish I knew, or there's so much I wish I could do. That spark of light, which is really key to understanding the winter solstice and Yule, is part of it. So that's why, so I use that idea of illumination at the beginning. And then of course, each of the chapters tackles a different theme within the wheel of the year. And you could, and you can use the book, like if you wanted to, you could literally go through the book one, each holiday reading a chapter, trying something.
Yeah.
And the book is structured for you to do that. You
Yeah.
could also start at wherever you are. So if you buy the book now, it's going to be the summer solstice.
Yes.
So you can start at the summer solstice. Or if you want to read the book faster, you could actually use the phases of the moon and do everything within a month. And there are rituals and there are practices and meditations and all kinds of things in the book to help you with these sacred actions. So there's lots of ways of doing it, but I just thought the wheel of the year was a really accessible way that a lot of people would be comfortable with. And for those people that are coming in that might be like an herbalist or, wild food forager that wants a more sacred nature spirituality practice tied to these things, that's going to give them a really nice introduction to something that's very common among neo-pagans, and I think something that's really familiar, and that really gives meaning. It's a meaningful way of thinking about the world and a meaningful way of living.
No, it really is. And we were talking earlier too a little bit. We're kind of in between here, coming up on the summer solstice, Letha. So maybe just to get that more in focus, how can our audience kind of maybe prepare a little bit? Is there a way to prepare for for
Or
Letha?
for the summer solstice generally,
Yes,
or
yes, yes, kind of. Hmm. Is
well,
there a warm up?
the summer solstice is the time of greatest light, obviously, in the sense that the winter solstice is the time of greatest darkness.
Right.
And so, more generally, in this book, we focus a lot on food and nourishment,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
I think is really important because this is the time, if we think about American culture, we're having parties, we're having barbecues, everybody's outside, and that food and that community piece is really important. So in
Hmm.
this chapter, not only do we talk about like thinking about local diets and those sorts of things, but also thinking about how do we build seasonal food rituals into what we do.
Hmm.
So if you're anywhere on the East Coast of the United States, for example, or some places in Europe,
Hmm.
um, you might decide that you want to create a maybe you want to go wild forage some elderflower and make an elderflower cordial and build that into part of your
Yeah.
ritual. Um,
Right.
so there's a lot of stuff in this particular chapter in the book about
Hmm.
thinking about our relationship with our food, which is, in
Hmm.
my opinion, it's a fantastic place to start with sacred action because
Hmm.
it's easier and more accessible if you have access to a farmer's market, you have access to a balcony, even if you have access to a sunny windowsill, you can
Hmm.
start doing some of this and
Hmm.
really connecting with seeds and connecting with food in a really powerful, sacred way.
Hmm.
So that's a little bit of how you might prepare for the winter or for the summer solstice
No,
coming.
that's great. I love the idea of the foraging. That for some that there's something very romantic about that. The foraging, I guess. And no, it's a great prep and in preparing, for Letha for the summer solstice is with the idea of honor. I mean, that kind of like goes through that particular chapter of honoring food and the process and everything. And I think it really is a good place to start. So coming out at a really good time right now for this book. So you're doing so much. You're living all of this here. So do you have time to read? Do you have time to
Yeah,
do everything? Okay. What do you
yeah,
read?
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah, you want to talk about books?
Yeah. Why not? We're yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like just to think about time, right, for a second before we get into books, like I think that we all choose how we spend our time and we all have
Mhm.
limited time. But to me, these are really important parts of my time. And I don't really see it as I guess I just see it as the way I live now. It's awesome. I don't watch a lot of TV. People are always like, well, how do you have time to do all this, Dana? I'm like inoculating mushroom logs and chasing chickens, and I'm like, well, when you sort of
Yeah,
step away from some of the stuff that takes up a lot of our time.
it's true.
um but
Yeah.
but on the topic of books, I really I read pretty extensively. I really enjoy reading.
Mhm.
One of the things I read a lot of are plant books and herbalism books. Just learning about the natural world as much as I can.
Mhm.
Obviously, I read a lot of books on nature, spirituality, and metaphysical materials because I think that those always they're sources of inspiration, and also
Mhm.
sources of personal practice.
Mhm.
I do enjoy science fiction and fantasy. I usually like to read at night before I fall asleep, and that's usually a good science fiction or fantasy book.
Nice. That's great. Yeah. So it's the multidimensional aspect of people is really fascinating, I think, and what gets people going and motivated and moving forward is just is fantastic. So I guess really and just talking about metaphysical topics, I know that you've created a tarot. We talked about your tarot a little bit before. Tarot of Trees, I believe it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Published. So
Yeah, I have the Tarot of Trees. That was actually the first project I put out into the world.
yeah.
I painted it when I was still in graduate school, and I painted it. It's funny how these things come about because I didn't really ever plan on being, an artist or an author with a capital A. And it's sort of, but I create these things, and people seem to really resonate with them. So the Tarot of Trees sort of happened that way. I couldn't find a deck that I really wanted to use, and so I started painting my own and sharing it online. And people are like, "Oh, you need to, publish this, put it out there in the
Yeah.
world." So I did that.
Right.
Yeah,
Hmm.
the Tarot of Trees is a 70. It's currently an actually 79 card deck. I have an extra card in there called Regeneration, which is a very important theme, which obviously you see in this book too.
Hmm.
And it's all tree themed. It's very whimsical. It's very fun.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's a neat project. If people are interested in trees, it's something to check out.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And just the practice of there's so many creative people like yourself who are just like that. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to go into this now. I'm going to investigate
Yeah.
this. And then, it's just like, and then some people was like, oh, well, that's really cool. Like, really? I'm just doing it. You're just doing it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's sort of the continual inspiration too. And that
Yeah.
creative process, like we talked about earlier, where it's just like, you're not, limiting yourself, I guess, to anything. It's just like, this
Yeah.
is like, it's just like, okay, well, this is what's coming through, I suppose. That's a
Yeah.
yeah.
I feel like the more that you create space for creative practices, the
Mm-hmm.
more that the creativity, the inspiration strikes you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, to me, whether I'm in the garden or the kitchen or my art studio or at my computer trying to write or, whatever it is, I
Mm-hmm.
do feel like if you sort of cultivate that and you're reading a lot and you're bringing in ideas and you're talking to people, like you can really like, it's like a garden. Like you can go outside and dig up a hole in your yard and plant potatoes, but it's
Mm-hmm.
probably, as my book says, it's probably pretty compacted and you probably want to do some soil work, right? But if
Mm-hmm.
you cultivate that soil and you have this rich garden bed and then you plant your potatoes in there, you're going to get an awesome harvest. And I really think about that. Like that's part of why I love to read and part of why I like to work on these kinds of things. And I think it's a lot of the stuff in this book in Sacred Actions is all about thinking about inspiring you to do some really interesting, exciting things.
No, it really is, and that kind of hammers it home. My thought as well, and it is inspiring. So that said, so what's next? What lies ahead for you? Where do we go from here?
Um, I always have projects in the hopper. One of the
Mhm.
big things we're doing right now, because it's like planting season at the homestead, is we're working on a pretty big forest regeneration project. When we bought this place, we had about an acre that can be cultivated, and then about 4 acres of land that can't. And so we've been really, and it was like partially logged when we got here. So we've been working really hard on bringing it back into a healthy place. Planting various kinds of woodland medicinal species and really thinking about how do we as humans, how can we be a source of good. So I've been really thinking about that in terms of both physical land healing and
Mhm.
metaphysical land healing, and that's kind of where my mind is right now.
Mhm.
That's one of the big projects that I'm sort of thinking about and writing about and meditating on and working with right now.
Mhm. That's fascinating. Yeah, so many. There's just so much to learn. I mean, just but those topics in general, herbal healing and medicinal forest. What would you call it? Medicinal forest? Um,
uh well, there's food forests, there's forest regeneration. Yeah.
right. I'm a
um
novice at this, if you can't tell.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think that this goes into this idea, right? It's a
Yeah.
variation on the theme. So Sacred
Mhm.
Actions is all about how do I live my daily life in a way that helps me both cultivate a sacred practice and
Mhm.
do good in the world. And so
Mhm.
my land healing stuff is just another way of thinking about that. It's like, how do I, living on a piece of land that's been pretty brutally damaged by humans, how can I be a force of good there? What can I
Mhm.
do to, what can I plant? What other practices, what rituals can I do? um,
Mhm.
and so that's a different take on it, but it's still an
It
interesting.
is right. No, it really it's cool. I mean, it's just there's no other word for it really. I mean, it's just profound and impactful. And my goodness. Well, so there's this just tip the iceberg here as far as what we've talked about today. So are you active on social media, and can
Yeah,
readers
yeah.
and people follow you, and how do they do that?
I have a blog, which is at thedruidsgarden.wordpress.com.
Okay,
I'll provide the links to you. I do
great.
have a Druids Garden Facebook page, and I'm also on Instagram. My Druids Garden blog and Facebook are mostly for my writing, and my Instagram is for my art. So I'd love for people to check it out.
Yeah, the artwork that's it kind of it's so subtly throughout this, but it's very impactful too. I that's what I was struck to just way back when this came in, and we started talking about this project and things. Just the artwork kind of grew throughout, and it goes throughout the book, and it informed other aspects of how it came out in the end too. With our this very specific cover to it and everything like that.
Yeah,
Again, it's fun. It's fun, and you kind of just want to dive into it, which I am
yeah.
currently. Yeah.
And like one of the things that I was really hoping that we managed, I think really successfully, is like really thinking about it not only as sort of ecological, but almost like one of those 1970s back to the land. That's was sort of my
Well,
inspiration.
exactly, exactly. The interesting thing is that I'm sorry to cut you off, but we, I don't think we necessarily talked about that, but it was just like it was just there waiting to be, okay, of course it has to come out like this.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
like,
Mhm.
when I was learning, some of my favorite books were from the 1970s, when people
Yeah,
sort of like woke up
right.
like, whoa, like there's all this cool stuff we can do. And so I'm really happy that we got that vibe, and I think it really does fit. And I hope people really enjoy, not only what I've written, but the art and how it inspires you.
Yeah, me too, exactly. So, well, it's been a wonderful discussion. So glad to have you here. So thanks to everybody who tuned in to our live event. It was so much fun. They always are, but it was just, I learned so much with this. I was really looking forward to this. I'm glad we had it. I'm going to read after, right? As soon as we're done, I'm going to read, I think.
Awesome.
Sacred Actions, Living the Wheel of the Year Through Earth-Centered Sustainable Practices is available on redfeathermbs.com, where the Mind, Body, Spirit and trade books are sold. So many thanks to all of you who tuned in. Have a beautiful day. It's beautiful out there. Take care, everyone.